The day I buried my wife, I thought my son would be the one person who would make sure I was not alone. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Dad, just call an Uber." I still remember those words because they were not loud, but they hurt more than any argument ever could. My name is Henry Caldwell, and at 72 years old, I believed I understood what family meant. I believed that after 50 years of marriage, after raising a child, and after giving everything I had to the people I loved, I would never have to question my place in my own family. But that day changed everything. My wife Laura and I spent nearly 5 decades building a life together in our small town in Ohio. We were never wealthy. We did not have expensive vacations or a large house filled with luxury. But we had something I always considered more valuable. We had love, trust, and the comfort of knowing we would always stand beside each other. Laura was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought extra food to neighbors, and who always found a reason to believe tomorrow could be better. When she passed away, it felt like the world had become quieter. The house that once felt warm suddenly felt empty. Every room carried a memory of her. Her favorite chair by the window, the coffee mug she used every morning, the little notes she left around the house reminding me of things she did not want me to forget. The day of her funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. Friends and neighbors came to say goodbye. They shared stories about Laura's kindness and the way she made people feel important. I was grateful for every person who showed up, because their presence reminded me that her life had mattered. My son Michael came too. I was happy to see him because, despite everything, I still saw the little boy I had raised. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle. I remembered staying up late helping him with school projects. I remembered working extra hours when he was young because I wanted him to have opportunities one never had. To me, Michael was not just my son. He was one of the greatest parts of my life. But over the years, things between us had slowly changed. Michael became successful. He built a career, bought a nice home, and created a busy life of his own. I was proud of him. I truly was. A father never stops wanting his child to succeed. But somewhere along the way, our conversations became shorter. Visits became less frequent. And I started feeling like I had moved from being his father to being another responsibility on his schedule. Still, I told myself not to complain. I told myself that children grow up. Life gets busy. People have obligations. I made excuses because that is what parents often do. We protect the people we love, even when we are the ones feeling hurt. After the funeral ended, everyone slowly began leaving. The sky was gray, and the cemetery was quiet. I stood there for a moment, saying goodbye to Laura in my own way. I thought Michael would walk beside me. I thought maybe he would ask if I was okay. I thought maybe he would tell me we would get through this together. Instead, he checked his phone and looked toward the parking lot. "Dad," he said, "I have some things I need to take care of. You can just call an Uber to get home, right?" For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. I looked at him and waited for him to realize how those words sounded. But he simply seemed busy, like this was just another task to complete. I forced a small smile and nodded. "Sure, Michael. I can do that." He left a few minutes later, and I stood there alone. The same son whose hand I held when he was a child had just walked away while I was grieving the woman I loved. As I waited for the ride that would take me home, I looked back at Laura's resting place and whispered, "I never thought I would feel alone with my own family." That was the moment I realized something painful. Losing my wife had broken my heart, but losing the feeling that I mattered to my son hurt in a completely different way. I did not know it then, but that lonely ride home would become the beginning of a journey that would change the way everyone saw me, including my son. The ride home after Laura's funeral was only 30 minutes, but it felt much longer. I sat quietly in the back seat of the car, watching the streets pass by through the window. The same roads I had driven thousands of times suddenly looked different. Everything around me was familiar, yet I felt like a stranger in my own life. I kept thinking about Michael's words. "You can just call an Uber." I tried to convince myself that he did not mean to hurt me. I told myself he was probably overwhelmed. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he did not realize how those words sounded. A father's heart has a way of protecting his children, even when they disappoint him. But deep down, I knew something had changed between us. When I arrived home, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence was almost overwhelming. For 50 years, Laura's presence had filled that house. She had a way of making even ordinary days feel meaningful. She would play music while cooking dinner. She would ask about my day even when she was tired herself. She always made sure our home felt like a place where people belonged. Now, every room reminded me of what I had lost. I walked into the kitchen and saw 2 coffee cups still sitting in the cabinet that we used every morning. I stood there for a long time, remembering all the simple moments that I once took for granted. That night, I barely slept. I looked through old photographs and remembered the life Laura and I built together. I saw pictures of family vacations, holidays, and birthdays. I saw Michael as a little boy with a big smile, holding my hand everywhere we went. Those memories reminded me of something important. I had not failed as a father. I had loved my son completely. I had been there when he needed me. When Michael was young, I worked long hours at the factory because I wanted to give him a stable childhood. There were weekends when I stayed home instead of spending time with friends because he had activities at school. There were times when I delayed my own plans because his needs came first. I never regretted those choices. A parent does not keep a list of sacrifices. You do those things because love does not feel like a burden. It feels natural. But as I sat alone in that house, I started asking myself a difficult question. When did I stop being someone my son wanted in his life and become someone he simply had to deal with? The next morning, I received a short message from Michael. He said he was sorry he could not stay longer after the funeral. He said he had a lot going on and hoped I understood. I stared at the message for several minutes. The old Henry would have immediately replied, "Of course, son. Do not worry about me." That was what I always did. I made things easier for everyone else. But this time, I did not answer right away. I put the phone down and looked around my quiet home. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit something I had avoided for years. I was tired of pretending I did not need anyone. I was tired of acting like being forgotten did not hurt. That realization did not make me angry. It simply made me honest. Over the next few days, I began taking care of the things that needed to be handled after Laura's passing. I organized her belongings carefully. I contacted people who needed updates. I continued attending the community meetings she cared about because I knew how much those connections meant to her. Slowly, I started noticing something. Even though I felt like I had lost my place in my own family, there were still people who remembered who I was. Neighbors stopped by. Friends shared stories about Laura. People asked how I was doing and genuinely waited for my answer. They did not see me as a problem to solve. They saw me as Henry, a husband who was grieving, a father who was hurting, a person who still had something to offer. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if Michael understood what he had done. But I knew one thing. My life was not over because someone failed to see my value. And without realizing it, I was about to discover a part of myself that had been hidden for years. After Laura was gone, I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye to her. I was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to live in a world where the person who had been beside me for almost 50 years was no longer there. Every morning, I still woke up expecting to hear her moving around the kitchen. I still found myself reaching for my phone to share a small thought with her. Then reality would return, and I would remember that the person I had shared my entire adult life with was no longer waiting for me at home. But during those quiet days, something unexpected began to happen. I started noticing the people around me. For years, Laura and I had been focused on our family and our responsibilities. We rarely thought about the impact we had on others. We simply lived our lives, helped where we could, and moved forward. But after her funeral, neighbors began stopping by. Some brought meals. Some shared stories about Laura. Others simply sat with me and talked. They reminded me of things I had forgotten. They told me about moments when Laura had helped them or when I had quietly supported someone without expecting anything in return. Listening to those stories made me realize something. A person's value is not always measured by the attention they receive from the people closest to them. Sometimes, the world sees your kindness before the people you love do. One afternoon, my neighbor Thomas came by with a small box. He said Laura had given it to him months earlier and asked him to keep it safe until the right time. Inside were some of Laura's notes and photographs from a community project she had been involved with for years. I had known she volunteered, but I never realized how much time and energy she had given to helping others. Laura always had a way of making important things seem ordinary. She never wanted recognition. She only wanted to make a difference. As I looked through those notes, I felt like I was hearing her voice again. One message caught my attention. It was written in her handwriting and addressed to me. It said, "Henry, never forget that the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes." People may not always notice what you do, but that does not mean it does not matter. I read those words several times. Laura knew me better than anyone. She knew that I often measured my worth by how much I could do for my family. She knew that I sometimes wondered whether my efforts were noticed. And somehow, even after she was gone, she was reminding me that my value was never dependent on someone else's approval. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the last few years. I thought about how much time I had spent waiting for Michael to call, waiting for him to visit, waiting for him to notice that I was still there. I realized that I had allowed someone else's attention to determine how I felt about myself. That was not fair to me, and it was not the life Laura would have wanted for me. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to continue something Laura started. I was going to help organize the community project she cared about. Not because I wanted recognition. Not because I wanted to prove anything to Michael. I was doing it because it mattered. For the first time in a long time, I had a purpose that belonged only to me. I began spending mornings at the local community center. I helped organize supplies, spoke with volunteers, and listened to people's stories. Slowly, something changed. I stopped feeling like a man who had been left behind. I started feeling like a man who still had something meaningful to give. I still missed Laura every day. I still wished I could tell her about everything happening. But I also felt like a part of her was with me through every person we helped. I did not know where this new path would lead. I did not know if Michael would ever understand what he had overlooked. But I knew I was no longer sitting in the same place waiting to be remembered. I was creating something new. And soon, more people than I ever expected would know my name. The weeks after I began helping with Laura's community project became some of the most unexpected weeks of my life. I thought I was simply keeping a promise to my wife, but I slowly discovered that I was also rebuilding a part of myself that I had forgotten existed. For years, my days had followed a familiar routine. I worked, I supported my family, and I tried to be the person everyone could depend on. After retirement, my world became smaller. I spent more time at home, and after Laura passed away, that world became even quieter. But the community center changed something inside me. Every morning, I walked through those doors and saw people who were grateful for the smallest acts of kindness. I met volunteers who had known Laura for years. They told me stories about how she encouraged them, how she always believed every person had something valuable to offer. Hearing those stories made me feel closer to her. It reminded me that although she was gone, the love she shared was still creating something positive. One day, a local organizer named Rebecca approached me after a meeting. She told me that people in the community had started noticing the work I was doing. I laughed because I did not think I was doing anything special. I was simply continuing what Laura had started. Rebecca smiled and said, "Henry, sometimes the people who make the biggest difference are the ones who never realize their own impact." I thought about that for a long time. For most of my life, I never looked for attention. I did not need applause. I did not need people to tell me I was important. But I realized there was a difference between not seeking attention and believing you do not deserve appreciation. That was a lesson I was still learning. Around the same time, I received another message from Michael. He asked how I was doing and said he hoped I was adjusting. I read the message several times. Part of me wanted to tell him everything that had happened. I wanted to tell him about the community center, the people I had met, and the purpose I had found. But another part of me hesitated. I wondered if he would even care. For years, I had shared parts of my life with him, but I often felt like he was too busy to truly listen. Instead of replying immediately, I decided to wait. I wanted to answer from a place of calm, not from the sadness I had carried for so long. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A reporter from a local newspaper visited the community center. She had heard about the project and wanted to write a story about the volunteers who kept it going. When she asked me why I became involved, I simply told her the truth. I said my wife had spent her life believing that people mattered, and I wanted to continue that belief. I did not talk about my pain. I did not talk about feeling forgotten by my son. I focused on Laura and the difference she made. The article was published a week later. I was surprised by how many people reached out afterward. Some people shared their own stories of loss. Others talked about family members they wished they had appreciated more. I realized that my story was not only about me. It was about something many people understood. The feeling of being overlooked. The desire to know that your life still has meaning. That evening, I sat in Laura's favorite chair and looked through the article. I smiled because I knew she would have been embarrassed by the attention. She never wanted recognition for herself. She only wanted people to care about one another. But I also knew she would be happy that something good had come from such a painful time. I had spent so many years believing my greatest role was being a husband and a father. Those roles were important, but they were not the only things that defined me. I was still Henry Caldwell. I was still someone with experiences, wisdom, and kindness to share. I did not know it yet, but that small newspaper article would soon lead to an opportunity far beyond my town. And when my son eventually saw where my journey had taken me, he would finally understand that the father he thought he had left behind was never truly lost. The attention from the newspaper article was something I never expected. I had spent my entire life avoiding the spotlight. I was not someone who wanted recognition or praise. I was simply a man who believed that helping others was the right thing to do. But after the story was published, more people began reaching out. They wanted to hear about Laura. They wanted to know why I continued the project she cared about so deeply. And every time I answered, I found myself remembering the lessons she had taught me. Laura always said that kindness was like planting seeds. You might never see where they grow, but that did not mean they were not making a difference. A few weeks after the article appeared, I received a phone call from a regional television station. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. I had never been interviewed before. I had no experience speaking in front of cameras. I was just Henry Caldwell, a retired man trying to honor his wife's memory. But the producer explained that they wanted to share a story about community, compassion, and the people who quietly make a difference. They said my journey represented something many people needed to hear. I agreed, although I felt nervous. The day of the interview, I arrived early at the community center. I walked through the same rooms where Laura had spent so much time helping others. I looked at the volunteers working together, and I felt grateful. This was never about me. It was about the people who continued to believe that kindness mattered. During the interview, the reporter asked me about my wife. That was the easiest question to answer because Laura was the reason I was there. I talked about her generosity, her patience, and the way she made people feel seen. I explained that after losing her, I needed to find a reason to keep moving forward. Continuing her work gave me that reason. The reporter also asked what I had learned from this experience. I thought about the question carefully before answering. I could have talked about loss. I could have talked about loneliness. But instead, I said something that surprised even me. I learned that your life does not lose meaning just because your circumstances change. Sometimes the hardest chapters reveal parts of yourself you never had the chance to discover. After the interview ended, I felt relieved. I assumed that would be the end of it. I never imagined that the segment would reach people beyond my small town. But a few days later, the producer called again. She told me the story had received an incredible response. People had shared messages about their own parents, grandparents, and loved ones. Many said they were reminded to appreciate the older people in their lives before it was too late. I sat quietly after that phone call, thinking about how unexpected life could be. A few months earlier, I was sitting alone after losing Laura, wondering if anyone would notice my absence. Now, strangers were telling me that my story gave them hope. It was a feeling I struggled to understand. I was not trying to become known. I was simply trying to find a way to keep going. That evening, I called Michael. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to share something with him. I wanted him to know what had happened. When he answered, I could hear the surprise in his voice. We talked for a few minutes, and I told him about the interview. There was a pause on the phone. "Dad, I had no idea," he finally said. His voice sounded different. Not rushed. Not distracted. Actually present. I told him I was not calling to make him feel guilty. I was not looking for an apology. I simply wanted to share a part of my life with my son. After we hung up, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not the hope that everything would instantly return to the way it used to be, but the hope that maybe people can change when they finally see what they have overlooked. I did not know that the interview would soon reach an even larger audience. I did not know that my son would eventually see me on the evening news. But I knew one thing. The man standing in that interview was not the same man who had waited alone for a ride home after his wife's funeral. The days following the interview felt strangely different. My life had not changed overnight in the ways people might imagine. I still woke up in the same house. I still made my own coffee every morning. I still missed Laura every single day. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time since losing my wife, I was not only thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what I still had to give. The television segment aired on a Friday evening. I did not even watch it when it first came on. I was at home, organizing some of Laura's old things and preparing for the next community meeting. I had no idea how many people would see it. I had no idea that my own son would be among them. The next morning, I received several messages from people I knew. They told me the interview had been shared by many viewers. Some people said my words reminded them of their own parents. Others said they called someone they had not spoken to in a long time. That meant more to me than any recognition ever could. If my story encouraged someone to appreciate the people they loved, then Laura's kindness had reached even further than I imagined. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Michael's name. For a moment, I simply stared at it. I wondered what he wanted to say. Since our conversation after the interview, things between us had been quieter. Not because we were angry, but because we were both trying to understand what came next. When I answered, Michael was silent for a few seconds. "Dad," he finally said, "I saw the interview." His voice sounded different. There was something in it that I had not heard in a long time. Reflection. "I did not know about everything you were doing," he continued. I sat down at the kitchen table and listened. For years, I had wanted Michael to see me. Not just as his father. Not just as someone who would always be there when needed. I wanted him to see the person I had become after a lifetime of experiences. "I should have been there for you," he said. Those words were simple, but they carried weight. I did not interrupt him. I let him speak. Michael admitted that after the funeral, he had been focused on his own responsibilities and failed to understand what I was going through. He said he had treated my grief like something that would simply pass with time. He realized that he had forgotten something important. Grief is not just about losing someone. It is also about learning how to continue living after your world changes. I appreciated his honesty, but I also knew that healing would take time. A few kind words could not erase months or years of feeling distant. Trust is something rebuilt through actions. "Michael," I said, "I do not need you to feel guilty. I need you to understand." There was a pause. "I understand now, Dad," he replied. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a while. I thought about how different this moment felt compared to the day of Laura's funeral. Back then, I felt invisible. I felt like my pain was something inconvenient. But now, my son was finally beginning to see what I had been carrying. That evening, I received another unexpected call. It was from the television producer. She explained that after the segment aired, a larger news program had contacted them. They wanted to feature my story because it represented something many people were talking about. They wanted to share the journey of a widower who found purpose after loss and continued making a difference in his community. I was surprised. I had never imagined myself appearing on television. I was not someone who chased attention. But I also realized something. This was not about fame. It was about the message behind the story. It was about showing people that life does not end when one chapter closes. Sometimes, the most difficult moments can lead us towards something we never expected. A few months earlier, I had been standing alone after my wife's funeral, wondering if I still mattered. Now, people across the country were hearing my story. And somewhere, my son was watching the father he thought he understood finally become someone he had never taken the time to see. After the news program reached a wider audience, my days became busier than they had been in years. I never expected a simple story about continuing Laura's work to attract so much attention. I was still the same man who lived in the same small town, walked the same streets, and spent quiet mornings remembering the woman who had shared my life. But now, people who had never met me were telling me that my story gave them hope. I found that both surprising and humbling. I had spent so many years believing that my most important role was being a husband and a father. After Laura passed away, I had to learn that I was still a person with dreams, experiences, and something meaningful to contribute. The television appearance opened doors I never imagined. I was invited to speak with community groups, local organizations, and people who wanted to hear about the project Laura cared about. Every time I spoke, I made sure the focus stayed on her. I told people that Laura was the reason I was standing there. She had spent her life reminding others that kindness mattered. I was simply carrying that message forward. Meanwhile, things between Michael and me slowly began to change. We started talking more often. At first, our conversations were short and careful. I could sense that he was trying to understand how much distance had grown between us. I also knew that rebuilding a relationship after years of emotional separation would not happen overnight. Some things require patience. Some things require both people to be willing to listen. One evening, Michael called and asked if he could visit. When he arrived, He looked around the house differently than he used to. He noticed the photographs of Laura. He noticed the notes she had left behind. He noticed the small details that showed how much love existed in that home. We sat in the living room and talked for a long time. He asked questions about the community project. He asked about the people I had met. He asked why I never told him about any of it before. I smiled because I knew the answer. "I did not think you were interested," I said honestly. The room became quiet. Michael looked down and took a deep breath. "Dad, I think I stopped seeing you as a person. I only saw you as my father. I forgot that you had your own life, your own memories, and your own purpose." Those words stayed with me, not because they fixed everything, but because they showed that he was finally beginning to understand. For years, I had wanted my son to recognize my sacrifices. But in that moment, I realized something important. I did not need him to spend the rest of his life apologizing for the past. I needed him to be present in the future. I told him about the day after Laura's funeral. I told him how alone I felt when he suggested I call a ride home. I did not say it to make him feel ashamed. I said it because honesty was the only way we could move forward. Michael listened without defending himself. That meant more to me than he probably realized. After he left that evening, I sat in the same chair where I had spent many lonely nights after losing Laura. But this time, the room felt different. The silence was not as heavy. I realized that forgiveness was not about pretending something never happened. It was about accepting what happened and choosing not to let it define the future. A few weeks later, the producers from the news program contacted me again. They wanted to include my story in a larger evening feature about people who discovered new purpose later in life. I agreed. Not because I wanted attention, but because I believed someone watching might need to hear the same message I needed to learn myself. Your life still matters after loss. Your value does not disappear when someone overlooks you. And sometimes, the people who forget your worth are the ones who eventually need to see it the most. The evening after Michael left my house, I sat quietly and thought about how much had changed. Months earlier, I had felt invisible. I had wondered if my own son still saw me as someone important in his life. Now, sitting in that same living room, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because there was finally understanding between us. For years, I believed that love between family members was something that should always come naturally. I thought that because Michael was my son, he would automatically understand my feelings. But I learned something important. Even the strongest family relationships need attention, communication, and effort. Love can remain, but people can become distant when they stop truly seeing each other. As the days passed, Michael began visiting more often. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Other times, we simply sat together and enjoyed ordinary moments. Those simple moments meant more to me than any grand apology could have. One afternoon, Michael helped me organize some of Laura's belongings. We found old photographs, handwritten notes, and memories from the life we built together. He looked through the pictures and smiled at the younger version of himself. Then he became quiet when he saw how much his mother had supported our family. "I never realized how much you both gave up for me," he said. I looked at him and told him something I had learned over the past few months. "Michael, parents do not keep a record of what they do for their children. We do those things because we love you. But one day, every child has to understand that their parents are people too. We have feelings. We have dreams. We need to feel valued." He nodded, and I could see that he was listening in a way he had not before. That conversation stayed with both of us. It was not about blame. It was about growth. It was about two people who loved each other but had lost their way trying to find their own paths. Around that time, the evening news feature about my journey aired. I watched it from home with a cup of coffee in my hand. Seeing Laura's picture on the screen brought back memories, but they were no longer only painful. They were reminders of a beautiful life we shared. The program focused on the community project and the message behind it. It talked about finding purpose after loss and understanding that every person, regardless of age, still has something valuable to offer. After the broadcast ended, my phone began receiving messages from people I knew and people I had never met. They shared stories about their own parents and grandparents. Some said they called family members they had not spoken with in years. Others said they were inspired to spend more time with the people they loved. That was the greatest reward I could have received. Not fame, not attention, just knowing that Laura's kindness continued to reach people. Later that night, Michael called me. He said he had watched the program again. "Dad, he said. "I finally understand something. I thought I knew who you were, but I only knew one part of you. I forgot that you were a whole person." I closed my eyes and smiled. Those words were simple, but they meant everything. I told him that I was proud of him for recognizing that. I also told him that I was grateful we still had time to build something better. As I placed the phone down, I looked at Laura's favorite chair near the window. I imagined what she would have said about everything that happened. She would probably remind me not to focus on the hurt, but to appreciate the healing. She always believed people were capable of becoming better versions of themselves. I finally understood why she believed that. The hardest moments in life can reveal painful truths, but they can also open the door to unexpected blessings. I lost my wife, and for a while, I thought I had lost my place in my family too. But I discovered something greater. I discovered that my worth was never determined by how others treated me. I discovered that a new chapter can begin at any age. And I discovered that sometimes, when people finally see the person standing in front of them, they find a relationship they thought was already gone. A year ago, I never imagined my life would look the way it does today. I thought my story was already written. I believed that after losing Laura, my days would become smaller and quieter, and that I would spend the rest of my life simply remembering the past. But life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, the moments that feel like the end of something are actually the beginning of something new. When I look back at the day of Laura's funeral, I remember the sadness. I remember standing there feeling alone, wondering how I could move forward without the person who had shared every important moment of my life. I also remember the pain of hearing my son tell me to find my own way home. At the time, I thought that moment represented everything I had lost. I thought it meant I was no longer important. But now, I see it differently. That painful moment became the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. It pushed me to discover who I was beyond being a husband and a father. It reminded me that my life still had meaning, even during a season when I felt forgotten. The community project Laura loved became more than a promise I made to her. It became a reminder that kindness can continue long after someone is gone. Every person we helped, every conversation we shared, and every life we touched became part of her legacy. I often think about how proud she would be, not because people recognized me, but because people were connecting with the message she lived by. She always believed that everyone deserved to feel valued. She believed age did not take away a person's ability to contribute. She believed that every person had a story worth hearing. I understand that now more than ever. My relationship with Michael is not the same as it was before. In some ways, it is better because it is more honest. We no longer pretend that everything has always been perfect. We talk openly. We listen to each other. We make time for the moments that truly matter. I know that Michael cannot change the past, and I do not expect him to. None of us can go back and rewrite the moments we regret, but we can choose what we do with the time we have left. That is what matters. I have learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened. It is about refusing to let pain control the future. It is about understanding that people can make mistakes and still have the ability to grow. Today, I still visit the community center. I still tell people about Laura. I still share the lessons I learned through the hardest chapter of my life. Sometimes, someone will come up to me and say that my story helped them appreciate their own family more. Those moments remind me that even difficult experiences can create something meaningful. If there is one thing I hope people understand from my journey, it is this. Never assume someone's story is finished just because they have entered a new season of life. A person can lose someone they love and still find purpose. A person can feel forgotten and still discover their value. A person can experience disappointment and still choose kindness. I lost my wife, but I gained a deeper understanding of love. I felt forgotten by my son, but I discovered that my worth was never dependent on someone else's attention. I thought I was waiting for someone to see me, but eventually, I learned to see myself. And that may have been the greatest gift of all. Because the truth is, every person has value. Every person has something to offer. And sometimes, the people who walk away from us are the very people who later realize they should have stayed close all along.